Joined us this week for this episode is Eddie Davis. Eddie is our supervisor at the Salem Hydraulic Shop, and so we're going to talk about the Salem Hydraulic Shop in detail, and but we'll also discuss Carter Machinery Hydraulics reconditioning facilities. But Eddie's agreed to join us, so thank you, Eddie, for sitting in with us.
No problem, Richard. Glad I could help.
We're going to really talk about three different things, and then we've got one thing on there for questions. Let's talk about the Carter Machinery Hydraulic Shops, the types of repair and repair options that Carter Machinery can offer. And then the Salem Hydraulic Shop, we're going to do a somewhat virtual tour. There's nothing like the real thing, so if you're ever in Salem and you want a tour, just give us a call and we'll figure that out. But we'll do the best we can with the situations that we have. So the first one here, the hydraulic shops. Carter Machinery has 5 hydraulic shops. Now, 4 of those hydraulic shops primarily only do hydraulic cylinder repair. The hydraulic shop in Salem does pumps, motors, valves, all sorts of powertrain components, hammers, swivels, pretty much anything except for hydraulic cylinders can be repaired at the Salem Hydraulic Shop. And of course, like I mentioned, we've got 4 other ones: Richmond, Virginia, Princeton, West Virginia, Winchester, Virginia, and Baltimore, Maryland. The really, really neat thing about having hydraulic shops around the company, and then with a great logistics team that we have daily shipping to each one of our hydraulic shops from most locations. So if you're in Warrenton, Virginia, and you drop a hydraulic cylinder off to have it repaired, it can be at one of our hydraulic cylinder repair shops the next day. And same thing goes with, say you're in Lynchburg, Virginia. You don't have to drive your component all the way to Salem to have it repaired. You can give it to the folks there at Lynchburg, and they'll make sure it gets up to Salem the next day. So it's really nice having a group of trucks that moves parts around, and we can put those components on those trucks and have those moved quickly and efficiently, and we can be sure to get you back up and running as quickly as possible. Here's a map that shows all of our facilities, but the ones circled in blue are our hydraulic facilities. Again, Salem is the only one that does pumps and motors and valves and things like that, but the Princeton, Richmond, Winchester, and Baltimore facilities work on hydraulic cylinders. So let's talk about the types of repairs that we do and the repair options that you have. So for cylinders, you can see we do cylinder honing. We have lathe capabilities for long pieces of steel that may need to be machined, so up to 35 feet you see there. Boring and straightening, torquing, all kinds of different options there for if you need to have a cylinder rebuilt. You know, a lot of work goes into making sure that cylinder is right. You know, anybody can pull a cylinder down and put seals in it. But if the rod is bent or the tube has got grooves in it or something like that, then, you know, it's not just a simple task. You got to get it right because you're depending on that machine for production. So when we do a cylinder repair, we make sure when we put it back together, it's done the right way. When we're working on, of course, in our Salem shop, we have pump and motor and valve repair work that we do. So we work on vane pumps and the more complex piston pumps and control valves and hydraulic motors. You can see there we've also got swivels and something we call HPCU transmissions, and They're very complex transmissions that used to be in track loaders, and then hydraulic hammers is another item that we work on. So work on just about anything hydraulic except for cylinders over in Salem. And some of the options for you, maybe you have a cylinder rod that has a bend in it. Well, you can straighten it out, or sometimes you have to re-rod a cylinder or even retube a cylinder. So the tube that the piston of the cylinder sits in can be replaced. You don't have to replace the whole cylinder. And, of course, re-chroming, that's something that we can do. Rebearing and reseal of different components, remanufacture completely. And of course, replace. Maybe you need a completely new or remanufactured component. Of course, we can help you with that too. So lots of different repair options. So let's go through and talk about the Salem Hydraulic Shop and do a little virtual tour here. So this is the just inside the shop over in Salem. And you can see there's a grate there on the floor. I'll put my indicator on it. And this black grate is where, when pumps and motors and valves and all these hydraulic components come in, this is where they land. That's where we put them. And when they go into that area, of course, a lot of them are leaking oil or fluid of some sort, and we don't want that stuff on the ground. So we've got this grate that catches all the oil. And from there, they're kind of staged, so we can determine what needs to be done to it, whose component it is, what machine it goes on, just kind of get it ready to have work done to it. This is where, if you look just to the side of this component here, there's a little tag that you see there. We put that tag on there to tell us whose component it is and what it's for. And also, I want to make note, over here on the right-hand side, if you look where my red indicator is on your screen, there's a hydraulic hammer that's being rebuilt. And they've got this table set up, and they're taking that hammer down, and they're going to do some work to it, and then they'll put it back together. So, as I mentioned, we rebuilt hammers and pumps and valves, and we don't see a whole lot of valves on this grate when this picture was taken, but sometimes there's some valves in here. Sometimes there's pumps and motors that aren't yellow that are on here, so certainly they can be repaired too. In this picture, we've got a technician that's disassembling a motor. And what you can tell is, he's working on this thing, and he's working over top of this table. It's kind of got a tank built into the table, and that's just about, controlling contamination as much as possible. Also, if you notice the floors in the shop, they're not covered in dirt. They're not. They don't have a bunch of trash on them. They have to keep the shop very, very clean. With today's equipment, they're stronger, they're more fuel efficient, they have capabilities that can far exceed anything of previous years. And with that comes the responsibility that during the repair process, you have to keep everything clean. The components got to be clean. And certainly the shop that you're working in has to be clean. So that's just some of the effort that we go through to make sure that when we build a component, it's right. One other thing to note is over here on the left-hand side of the screen, if you'll see my red indicator, there up on top of his toolbox is what looks like a white bucket. But what that is some disposable lint-free cloths. And So they use those to clean different components or different parts of components for inspection processes, or even when they get into the assembly process. And lint-free is super important because a piece of lint can damage a hydraulic component internally. So that's what they're using in this particular scenario.
You was talking about the tables, Richard. I'd like to mention that each one of our tables actually has that tank built into the bottom of it for collection purposes. Any oil or grease or anything that runs out of the components gets caught in that collection tank. It helps create a cleaner atmosphere. And each one of the tables is actually a scissor lift table that the guys actually can adjust up and down for ergonomic standpoint. You know, they can bring the work up to them. They don't have to bend over. You know, they can bring the table up to the best working heights for them. And it just helps with the workflow through the shop, trying to set everything up from an ergonomic standpoint.
Sure. Yeah. To meet the best working height for that technician with that component, right?
Correct.
Also notice that we've got a pump that's been disassembled on the cart right here. And we'll take a closer look at that in just a minute. But this is when we start to see these baskets. And these parts baskets are pretty important to keeping all of the parts to that component organized and with those that component along the process of rebuild.
About some of the stuff laying out here, you know, some of the processes that we go through. If you look at the right-hand corner of the push-around cart, you know, you'll see a set of pistons there out of that pump, and we'll visually inspect that set of pistons for any visible defects, the swash plate that goes along with it, you know, the head of the pump and the port plate. We visually, you know, inspect every piece that comes out of that pump for any type of defects or wear. And, you know, when we can lap the pistons and the port plate and everything back and the barrel to get a good tight fit when we build this thing back together. But just each aspect of this component is visually inspected for any type of defects or wear.
Very good. And there are very tight tolerances inside of those things. You can't have it too tight, but you can't have it too loose either, right?
Correct. Some of them is like they'll give you a dimension and it's plus or minus 1/1000 is the tolerances. So you talk
That's
about
very tight dam.
A thousandth of an inch, you know. So
once the inspection process is done, and as Eddie mentioned, sometimes there are components that don't pass inspection and maybe they need to be lapped. We've got some lapping tables that can basically they make a smooth surface on a piece of metal, and the components can be taken to the machine shop. Maybe there's some wear in a certain spot and they may need to have something machined, they may need to be sleeved. All kinds of different things can happen within a component that make it need additional work. And so once everything's been inspected and it's been determined what work or what parts need to be replaced, those baskets, all the parts have been cleaned now, and they come over to this rack, and this rack is located within the clean room. And so we have a ticket here that this piece of paper tells us whose component is in the basket, and it'll tell us what machine it's for, and if they're waiting on parts or waiting on machine work or whatever it is that we're waiting on before the assembly process can begin. It'll be on that ticket. And so each one of these is a separate job. So you can see this one is not directly related to this one. And so this is their way of keeping jobs organized and keeping the parts and pieces that came out of that component with that component throughout the process. And then we move on to the assembly process. So what we're looking at right now is we're inside of the clean room, and the clean room, and I mentioned this before in our previous shop talk, the clean room is my favorite spot when we're doing an actual tour. I sometimes volunteer to do the tours of the facility, and on a hot summer day, the clean room is nice and air conditioned, and it's my favorite spot to go. It's climate controlled, and they do that specifically to keep the room clean. So if you'll notice, the floor doesn't have any debris on it. There may be some damage down here, but that's not debris on the floor. Here is the shelves that we were looking at just a minute ago over on the left-hand side of the screen. And you'll notice, again, this is the table that Eddie was mentioning that has a tank built into it. Now, in this case, we shouldn't have any oil or anything coming out of this component, but when we use assembly oils or some kind of lubes to put O-rings in and things like this, that stuff can drain over into the table. And again, we need to remain vigilant to catch any contamination that we can. Again, this table moves up and down to adjust for whoever is assembling this component and for the component. Sometimes you're putting a component that needs to be stacked really high, so you can adjust the table to meet the needs of the technician at the time. And so this is a climate controlled area, and we've got blankets on top of the component when it's not being worked on. And all of these extra steps that we take are for the end result of, we don't want you putting a dirty component on your machine. That's what we're chasing here. Here's one of the technicians, and Brent is in this picture. He's assembling a pump, and he's getting it ready to go over for testing. So everything that goes through the shop, we've got to test it before we send it out to be run on a machine. You can see in this case, Brent has the table up a little higher because he's a taller gentleman, and we've got our tag here that tells Brent what exactly he's working on, who the customer is, and what needs to be done to it. You can see he's got some parts around here where he's installing new parts into this component, or maybe machine parts into this component, and he's getting ready to go. You can see that he's got some blankets and towels back here in the background that if he steps away to go to lunch, or at the end of the day, maybe he didn't finish this up that day, then at the end of the shift, he'll cover that component up to make sure that there's no dust or debris that gets into that component. So once Brent's finished with the assembly process, it'll go here to one of the two test benches. This test bench is the 200 horsepower test bench. Notice that there's a grate down here in the floor, and this grate in the floor is there to catch any fluid that might be spilled during the assembly, testing phase of the process. Now, what happens is maybe a technician would disconnect this line, and a little bit of oil would come out. Well, that oil goes down and goes through like a pre-filter, and then it gets filtered a couple of times before it goes back into the storage tank of the machine. So they do what they can to keep this oil really clean. For this particular machine, there's 4 great big filters in the back of it, and it's got like 200 gallons of oil, and they definitely try their best to keep this thing from being contaminated. In this case, I think I mentioned it, they're testing a motor, but this test bench can test a pump just as easily. It can test valves, pretty much anything we would need to test going through the hydraulic shop.
Yeah. And Richard, just touching on that, we was talking about contamination. We do pull oil samples monthly on both of our test benches. Like the one you're looking at here is our 400 horsepower test bench. So we got a 200 horsepower and a 400 horsepower to drive some of these bigger pumps and motors that we deal with. We pull oil samples on them monthly to make sure we are following the guidelines as far as contamination control goes to keep our oil clean, because it wouldn't do any good for us to try to keep everything clean through the shop and then put it on a test bench with the oil not being to the ISO count that it should be. You know, and then that leads me into another situation. Sometimes we get requests from customers, hey, you know, if I send you this pump down here off of my machine, can you test it? Well, the answer is yes and no. We're more than happy to try to accommodate people, but you know, these test benches at any given moment has about 200 gallons of oil in them that we have to try to keep clean. So, you know, before we can just take someone's component and put it directly on our test bench, we have to tear that component down far enough to visually inspect it and clean it and make sure it hasn't failed, make sure it's not generating any debris before we put it on our test bench, because the last thing we want to do is contaminate our system, because it takes a lot of time and effort at that point to get it clean back to where it's supposed to be. So.
Sure. And every component that runs across it afterwards is going to be susceptible to holding that contaminant and putting it in the next customer's machine.
Correct.
Gotcha. Yeah, so it's very important that we control contamination as much as we can, and you know, sometimes it's a painful process to try to keep everything as clean as possible, but we have to do it in order to turn out a quality product in the reconditioning process. And you can see in this case, on the test bench, they've got a big pump that they're testing. They got multiple hoses hooked up to it, and that big red hose that you see there is supplying oil to it. And there's a bunch of gauges over on the left-hand side, and they can make adjustments to that pump and test it the way it should be running on a machine. One really good thing about having these test benches is the capability of setting that component up like it would be set up on a machine. So if you're a customer and you have a pump that's failed, and we do the recondition to the pump and we get the thing up and running again, you don't have to have a bunch of special flow meters and extra tooling when it comes time to put that pump back onto your machine. When you get that pump back from us, we're going to set it up as long as we have the specifications, which for the CAT components we do, but if it's another manufacturer's pump, we may not have it. But as long as it's a CAT pump, we can set it up just like it would be set up on the machine. So when you get that pump back, you put that pump in to your machine, you hook all the hoses up and everything, and fill yourself up with hydraulic oil, and you're good to go. You don't need to do any additional adjustments or testing to confirm that everything is set up correctly. So that's what these test benches provide us, is that capability to get you up and running faster and exactly the way it should be. You shouldn't have to spend hours out there adjusting a pump after you get done with the rebuild process. Let me thank Eddie for joining us and taking time out of his day to help us walk us through what's going on in the hydraulic world. Lots of neat things that they're doing. So thank you again, Eddie.
No problem, Richard.
I want to tell you before we sign out here, we've got some upcoming shop talks. On June 17th, we're going to talk about undercarriage visual inspection. And then on June 24th, we'll talk about the CAT batteries. So if you've seen the CAT Genuine Parts filters shop talk that we did a few weeks back, this will be a continuation of that, talking about batteries. So as always, if you have questions or suggestions, please drop us a line at shoptalkchannel@cartermachinery.com. We appreciate any feedback that we can get from you all, and or if you have any questions, maybe you want to take a tour of the facility, just drop us a note, and we'll be more than happy to figure out how we can accommodate you. So thank you for your time, And Carter Machinery thanks you for your business.